The first sound was not the usual morning shuffle of sneakers and laughter in the school hallway, but the deep, insistent scrape of claws against metal. Students slowed, whispering, their voices thinning into silence as they circled around the source of the noise. At locker number 218, a German shepherd named Max pressed his body low, his paw raking at the dented door with an urgency that seemed almost desperate. His handler, Agent Ruiz, was still 2 steps behind, caught between embarrassment at the spectacle and the gnawing recognition that Max was rarely wrong. The dog's nails screeched again, sharp against steel, before he froze. His muscles quivered, nose pressed so tightly to the seam of the locker that his breath fogged the cold surface. Ruiz called softly, but Max didn't turn. His ears were pinned forward, eyes locked with a kind of intensity that unsettled even the teachers standing nearby. Ruiz had worked with him through floods, collapsed buildings, even a missing child in a winter storm, but he had never seen Max so singularly consumed. The hallway air seemed to hold its breath with him. A boy's voice broke the quiet, nervous. "It's just old sandwiches, right?" The attempt at humor died quickly. Max's tail stiffened, the low rumble of a growl building from somewhere deep in his chest. A shiver ran through the crowd. Ruiz felt the familiar pull in his gut, an instinct honed over 20 years of fieldwork. Something was about to surface which none of them were prepared for. The janitor, heavy keys jangling, shuffled through the circle and knelt by the locker. His fingers trembled only slightly as he slid the key in, the metal clicking louder than it should have. Ruiz wanted to tell him to wait, to give Max more space, but the murmuring students were pressing in, their curiosity dangerously close to panic. When the latch finally snapped open, Max lunged forward, pawing so hard the door swung wide against the neighboring locker. A single object slipped out, clattering onto the tiled floor. It wasn't food, it wasn't homework. It was small, metallic, and oddly heavy in the hand. When Ruiz stooped to pick it up, for a moment he only stared at it, his throat dry, unable to place why its weight felt familiar. Then recognition struck like a cold blade. The silence around him deepened, pressing against his ribs. Even Max, restless seconds before, stood completely still. Ruiz looked up in the faces around him, children, teachers, an assistant principal. Clutching his clipboard, he saw confusion beginning to sharpen into fear. His own pulse hammered louder than their whispers. What had just fallen out of locker 218 was not meant to be in a school, not meant to be anywhere near children. And in that charged stillness, Ruiz understood 2 things. Max had just uncovered something that would spiral far beyond this hallway, and nothing about the next days would be ordinary again. The object sat cold in Ruiz's palm, catching the dull fluorescent light. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Even Max, whose whole body had been coiled with urgency, stood frozen, ears tilted, gaze fixed on the thing as though it were alive. The hallway's chatter, the laughter that had carried moments before, had evaporated into a silence that pressed against the walls. Ruiz's fingers closed around the weight, hiding it from the children's widening eyes. But he knew concealment would buy him seconds at best. "Step back," Ruiz said softly. Not an order, not barked, just a tone edged with something the students had never heard from him before. They obeyed instantly, shuffling backward, their sneakers squeaking against the tiles. The janitor stared at the locker's hollow interior, pale and shaken, as if it had betrayed him. Ruiz slid the object into his pocket, the metal thudding against his thigh like a pulse. Max broke the stillness first. His head lifted, nostrils flaring, as if the scent of the hallway itself had shifted. He padded toward the far end, claws clicking lightly. His body no longer held the frantic desperation of discovery, but something sharper, more purposeful. Ruiz followed, every muscle taut. He had trusted Max in burning ruins and in the thick of storms, but this felt different. The dog wasn't just finding, he was leading. Outside the glass doors, the sky had begun to change. A wind had picked up, scattering dry leaves across the empty courtyard, rattling them against the benches like brittle bones. Ruiz caught his reflection in the glass. A man weathered, his hair silvering at the edges, eyes marked by years of carrying what others should never have to see. For the first time in years he felt the shadow of dread inching into his chest, not as an officer, but as a father who knew the fragile world children thought was safe could splinter without warning. A voice came from behind Principal Hargrove, stern but shaken. What did he find? His words carried authority but cracked at the edges. Ruiz didn't answer, not yet. He watched Max pause at the doors, body stiff, ears twitching. The dog growled low, a sound Ruiz had learned meant not just threat, but recognition. Somewhere out there was more. The object in Ruiz's pocket seemed heavier with each step, as if it carried not just metal but memory. He remembered Afghanistan, the desert winds tearing across open ground. Max younger then, his bark echoing off stone when he pulled them toward a roadside ditch. They had found wires hidden beneath sand, the kind meant to erase a convoy in seconds. Ruiz had learned that day to never second-guess what Max chose to show him. And now, in the quiet corridors of an American school, that same instinct returned, brutal in its clarity. This was not random, not harmless. "Clear the hallway," Ruiz said finally, turning to Hargrove. His voice was level, but it left no room for refusal. Teachers began ushering students away, murmuring reassurance they didn't believe. The air thinned, the once bustling space shrinking into a hollow shell. Ruiz opened the doors, and the wind struck his face with the sharpness of late autumn. Max surged forward, nose to the ground, pulling with a force that seemed less like obedience and more like necessity. The courtyard was empty, yet not still. Leaves spiraled in restless patterns. Somewhere, faintly, a metallic rattle echoed. Fence chain stirred by the wind or something less ordinary. Max led him past the flagpole, down toward the service gate that opened to the wooded edge of the property. His body moved with a certainty that made Ruiz's throat tighten. Whatever trail he had caught, it was recent. When Max stopped, it was at the base of the chain-link gate, nose pressed against a patch of earth disturbed by more than wind. A footprint, shallow but fresh, pressed into the damp soil. Ruiz crouched, his hand hovering above it, reluctant to touch. It was the kind of print made not by sneakers, but by heavy boots, the tread sharp and deliberate. He exhaled slowly, a sound more like surrender than breath. The janitor's keys jangled again behind him, followed by hesitant footsteps. Ruiz didn't look back. His gaze stayed on the earth, the boot print holding him there. Max lowered himself into a sit, eyes on Ruiz, silent but insistent. The connection between them was unspoken, years of trust distilled into this moment. They both knew the trail didn't end here. Above them, the sky dimmed, clouds moved in, veiling the pale sun, and the courtyard slipped into shadow. Ruiz stood, the object in his pocket, heavy enough to alter his stance. The school bell rang somewhere in the distance, its sound hollow against the wind. Children's voices rose faintly, muffled behind walls, unaware of what had already shifted in the ground beneath them. Ruiz rested his hand briefly on Max's back, grounding himself. The dog's fur bristled under his palm, warm and alive against the chill. He felt a thought, unshaped but certain, stirring in the silence. This was not about a school locker anymore. Behind him, Principal Hargrove spoke again, quieter this time, as though afraid to hear the answer. "Agent, what happens now?" Ruiz didn't reply. His eyes stayed fixed on the tree line beyond the gate, where the wind carried a smell faint and metallic, the kind that didn't belong to soil or leaves. The silence lengthened, filled only by the rustle of branches. Max's ears flicked, his gaze locked forward, and then, from somewhere deeper in the woods, came a sound faint as breath, one sharp crack, like metal striking stone. The object lay in Ruiz's palm, its cold surface pressing into his skin as though it carried a secret of its own. Max stood frozen, his body rigid, ears taut, his eyes never leaving the small piece of metal. Around them, the hallway had dissolved into a hush so heavy it felt unnatural, as if the building itself strained to hear what might happen next. Ruiz exhaled, the sound rough in his throat, and slid the object quickly into his jacket pocket. He didn't want children's eyes on it any longer. A teacher whispered something sharp in order for the students to step back, and the crowd shuffled in retreat. Sneakers squeaking against polished linoleum. Ruiz felt his pulse quicken, not just with professional alertness but with something darker, a recognition he couldn't yet put into words. The object had been out of place. Yes, but it was more than that. It belonged to a world that was not meant to touch this one. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of it in his pocket, the way one might test the teeth of a blade. Max whined low in his throat. That sound, more than anything else, unsettled Ruiz. The dog rarely vocalized in the field, except when the weight of what he smelled outstripped his training. Ruiz crouched beside him, placing a steadying hand between his shoulders. The shepherd's muscles twitched under his palm, tensed as coiled wire. Ruiz didn't need words. He knew Max was telling him the story wasn't finished, that the metal object was only the beginning. Outside, through the long windows, autumn leaves scraped across the courtyard, their papery edges catching the wind like brittle whispers. It struck Ruiz, then, that nature itself often mirrored human silence, a forest holding still before a storm, the ocean retreating before a wave. He wondered if this school, with its bright banners and locker-lined halls, was about to feel that same retreat, the breathless pause before something larger crashed down. The principal appeared, her expression drawn tight, her voice low and brittle as she demanded to know what had been found. Ruiz gave no answer, not yet. Words had power, and some truths were best delayed until they could be delivered to ears that would understand their full weight. Still, the way her eyes lingered on his hand in his pocket told him she suspected it was no ordinary contraband. He rose slowly, guiding Max toward the locker again. Something inside him insisted that one object could not explain the dog's persistence. Max sniffed hard at the open space, pawing at the bottom as if the very floor might give way. Ruiz gestured for the janitor to pull the metal shelf free. The man hesitated, his breath shallow, then slid the panel aside. A second object slipped out, smaller this time, wrapped in plain brown paper that bore faint oil stains at its edges. Ruiz picked it up carefully, the paper crinkled like brittle leaves. He peeled it back just far enough to glimpse the contents, a flash drive, old and scratched, but heavy with implication. His chest tightened. It wasn't the hardware itself that troubled him, it was what it could hold. Names, numbers, maps, words sharp enough to cut through the safety of an entire town. Max backed away then, ears flattening, his body lowering to the ground as if bracing for something unseen. Ruiz felt the echo of that posture in his own chest, a dread that tightened the ribs, a sense of stepping onto ground that might crack beneath him. The hallway seemed to close in, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder, sharper, like hornets gathering. Above, he closed his fist over the drive and looked at the students' faces. Curiosity, fear, a hunger to understand what they could not name, it was all there. He knew their lives were about to bend, however slightly, toward a shadow they had not expected. He had felt it before, on nights when raids unearthed more than weapons, when the real discovery was the depth of what humans could conceal. The assistant principal cleared his throat, but the sound was thin, without authority. Ruiz turned away, signaling for the corridor to be cleared. The teachers moved quickly now, ushering the children out, their voices hushed but urgent. The hallway emptied until only Ruiz, Max, and the lingering echo of retreating footsteps remained. For a moment he stood still, the objects heavy in his pocket, Max pressed close to his side. The silence that followed was not peace but a held breath, the kind of pause that comes before a question is asked that no one wants answered. Ruiz stared at the open locker, at the shadow inside it, and felt the weight of a story just beginning to speak. Then, from somewhere deep in the building came the faint slam of another locker door, not one of fear or accident but deliberate, steady, as if answering what they had just uncovered. Ruiz turned his head, pulse quickening, while Max's ears snapped toward the sound. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. Hand closed around the object, the metal biting cold against his palm, heavier than its size should have allowed. Around him the hallway seemed to blur the rows of lockers, the muted colors of backpacks, even the children's wide eyes of it fading into the background hum of fear. Max's body was rigid, nose still pressed toward the open locker, as though scenting echoes that human senses could never catch. Ruiz straightened slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze fixed on him. The janitor coughed, the sound thin and brittle. "What is it?" someone whispered. A teacher maybe, her voice cracking as though she already feared the answer. Ruiz didn't speak. He couldn't, not yet. To give shape to the object with words was to confirm the storm that was already gathering in the quiet edges of the room. Instead, he slipped it into an evidence pouch clipped to his belt, his movements deliberate, calm, measured. But inside, his chest was tightening, not from fear alone but from the knowledge that whatever web this belonged to was far wider than a single school hallway. Max pulled back then, circling the locker once before sitting sharply on his haunches, eyes locked on Ruiz. It was not the relaxed obedience of a well-trained dog but something keener on insistence. A demand that Ruiz recognized the gravity of what they had stumbled upon. His handler's throat worked against the dryness there, the years of instinct whispering to him that Max had only scratched the surface. The principal finally found his voice, brittle with authority that sounded more fragile than firm. "Agent Ruiz, this is highly irregular. Surely it's a mistake, perhaps some kind of training exercise." His attempt at reason felt hollow, misplaced. Ruiz only shook his head once, sharp and quiet. Around them the students shuffled back, their sneakers squeaking against the tile, the air heavy with questions too dangerous to voice. Then Ruiz noticed it, the faintest rustle, not from the crowd, not from Max, from within the locker itself. He froze, hand hovering near his sidearm, though his instincts told him this wasn't a moment for steel but for silence. The janitor leaned closer, squinting into the dark compartment, before flinching back with a muttered curse. A slip of paper, torn and creased, had been caught beneath the shelf. Ruiz reached for it, his fingertips brushing dust before pulling. The note free. The handwriting was jagged, rushed, almost frantic. Only a few words, but enough to sharpen the edges of dread. "They are already here." The hallway's air seemed to constrict. He folded the note and slid it into the same pouch as the metal object, his movements slow, his pulse a thunder. In his ears he had seen threats scrawled before, idle warnings from frightened hands, but paired with the weight of what Max had unearthed, this was no child's mischief. A gust of wind rattled the tall windows at the end of the corridor, carrying the sharp scent of rain. It made the fluorescent lights flicker briefly, shadows shifting across the children's faces. Max growled low, his ears turning not toward the locker at this time, but toward the double doors leading out to the playing fields. Ruiz followed his gaze, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw movement beyond the glass. Something too swift to place, too fleeting to name. He stepped forward, and the crowd parted instinctively, silence pressing down heavier than any shouted order could have achieved. Each face around him reflected the same truth he carried inside. The ordinary rhythm of the school day had already fractured. In its place, something vast and uncertain had begun to move. Ruiz laid a hand gently on Max's back. The dog was taut, vibrating with the kind of focus that precedes decision. His handler knew that look, knew it from nights when ruins smoldered and survivors hid somewhere beyond the rubble. Max was never wrong. The problem was not whether to trust him, it was whether Ruiz was ready to see where that trust would lead. Exhaled, long and controlled, before nodding once. "We clear the building," he said, his voice level but carrying the unmistakable gravity of command. The principal hesitated, lips parted as though to argue, but the tone left no space for debate. The children, sensing the shift, began to move under the quiet guidance of their teachers. The shuffling of their footsteps echoed strangely, hollow, against the linoleum still. Ruiz lingered by the open locker, its dark interior now looking less like a compartment for books and more like a doorway to something he could not yet name. He could feel the story tugging at the edges of the moment, threads leading outward into places he didn't yet dare follow. The rain had begun in earnest now, soft at first against the glass, then harder, drumming like a second pulse. Max's growl deepened again, head tilting as though he heard something beyond the storm. Ruiz followed his gaze once more, eyes narrowing at the blurred outline near the edge of the playing field. A figure, perhaps, or only a trick of the light and the rain. But the dog's body was trembling, every nerve alive with certainty. Ruiz's hand tightened on the leash. The note's words burned in his pocket, and as thunder rolled far in the distance, he realized they were no longer waiting for answers inside a school. They were standing at the threshold of something much larger, something already watching from the rain. The rain thickened, veiling the playing fields in a shifting gray. Ruiz stood rooted, one hand firm on Max's harness, the other still curled around the pouch where the metal object and note pressed against his chest. Max didn't lunge or bark. Instead, he leaned his weight against Ruiz's leg, his body trembling with a tension that slowly began to ebb, as if the storm itself were carrying the danger farther away. The blurred figure beyond the glass had vanished, leaving only the rhythmic pulse of water dripping from the eaves. For a long moment, no one spoke. The children had been led outside, voices hushed, their absence turning the hall into a hollow shell. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, but the sound felt muted beneath the steady percussion of rain. Ruiz bent down, brushing Max's damp ears back. The dog's eyes lifted to his steady, unblinking, their focus no longer on the locker or the field but on him alone. It was as if Max had delivered all he could, and the rest was for Ruiz to carry. He reached into the pouch and withdrew the object once more, holding it up under the dim light. Its weight seemed different now, not just metal, but memory, consequence, a fragment of something far larger that would unravel long after this day was gone. The note crinkled beneath his thumb, its words simple, final. "They are already here." Ruiz let out a slow breath, the kind that draws years into a single exhale, and slid the evidence back into place. The principal approached tentatively, his shoes squeaking against the floor, but Ruiz raised a hand before he could speak. There was nothing to explain, nothing that words could soften. The truth would be carried in silence, handed to men and women in darker rooms who would pick apart its meaning. But here, in this corridor where children once laughed and lockers clanged open with the trivial weight of books and lunches, the meaning was more personal. It was the quiet knowledge that vigilance had a cost, that innocence was thinner than anyone wanted to believe. Max shook himself, sending flecks of rainwater scattering across the tile, then sat chest rising and falling with the steadiness of completion. His fur clung dark against his body, the storm outside finding its mirror in his damped coat. Ruiz placed a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the warmth beneath the pulse of life that had guided him here. Together they stood in the hollow, quiet, two figures bound not by the magnitude of what had been found but by the unspoken trust that had led them through it. Outside, the last of the students were being herded onto buses, their bright raincoats darting like small fragments of color against the gray. A teacher looked back through the glass, her expression unreadable, then turned away, the bus doors closing with a hiss that sounded final. Ruiz watched until the taillights faded down the wet road, until the only motion left was the restless sway of trees bowing beneath the storm. He turned at last, guiding Max toward the exit. The dog padded beside him. Calm now, his earlier intensity softened into something quieter, almost solemn. The world smelled of wet earth and rust, the scent of rain soaking into concrete. Ruiz paused on the threshold, the doorway framing the sodden playing fields, and let the silence settle into him. He thought of the children, of the teachers' frightened faces, of the locker that stood ajar like a mouth unable to close on its own secrets. He thought of the note's simple words and the certainty they carried that this was not an ending but the faint tremor of something larger still unfolding. And yet, there was peace in the present moment, peace in Max's steady gaze, in the rain cleansing the empty grounds, in the knowledge that, for now at least, the danger had been caught before it claimed what it sought. He reached down once more, fingers brushing the damp fur at Max's neck. "Good work," he whispered, though the words seemed too small for what had been given. They stepped out together, the rain washing over them, blurring the edges of the day into soft shapes. The door closed behind with a heavy click, sealing the hollow silence within. The storm stretched over the horizon, vast and unbroken, carrying with it the weight of unanswered questions. Ruiz walked on, Max at his side, each step slow, deliberate, etched into the wet earth like a quiet vow. The playing field lay empty. But in the mud, near the glass doors, Ruiz noticed the faint impression of a bootprint half washed by rain, half clinging to the soil. He stared at it for a moment, then turned away, the image imprinting itself in his mind as both warning and reminder. Some traces never vanished completely. As they moved farther from the building, the stormlight shifted, pale silver cutting briefly through the clouds. Max paused, nose lifted into the damp wind, then pressed forward again, his body sure and steady. Ruiz followed, his eyes on the horizon, where the rain softened into mist, and in that quiet, with the storm behind and the uncertain road ahead, a single truth lingered. Sometimes the greatest revelations fall not with thunder, but in silence, carried on the breath of a loyal companion who scratches at a door until the world is forced to listen.